What's more cruel than the day meant to celebrate your life becoming your last day on Earth? I'm Nathan, and these are 5 times birthday celebrations gone wrong. From a retired surveyor buried by the exact hillside he once warned the government about, to a birthday celebration that ended with a firework blast powerful enough to shatter a man's skull. It was noon on May 16, 2014, near Boone, North Carolina, after 6 straight days of heavy rain. On a grassy overlook above a steep valley, a family gathered for an outdoor birthday party while the saturated soil beneath them slowly turned unstable. Before retiring, Elias Forn, 67, had spent 40 years working as a government surveyor across western North Carolina. He was the guy who mapped flood zones, laid out roads, and tracked hillsides where storms turned solid ground into liquid mud. Co-workers called him careful, quiet, and impossible to rattle. His work was technical, sure, but it wasn't magic. Elias knew that a hillside can hold itself together for decades until water fills the tiny gaps between soil and rock. Once that happens, roots lose their grip, clay turns to grease, and the slope can give out without a second's notice. Elias understood this better than anyone, which is exactly what makes his final choices that day so heartbreakingly hard to explain. That morning, his daughter brought the family out to a small overlook above a wooded valley. The spot had been Elias's favorite lunch stop during his surveying years, and the family chose it because he used to bring them there when the kids were younger. It was meant to be a simple birthday gathering with folding chairs, sandwiches, a cooler, and a birthday cake. But the weather wasn't cooperating. Flood advisories had already been broadcast, and the nearby ditches were running thick and brown with washed-out topsoil. Elias, being Elias, noticed the warning signs almost immediately. The grass near the edge felt spongy and soft under his boots. Fine, hairline cracks had started opening up through the wet dirt near some exposed tree roots. A thin, steady stream of muddy water was already cutting its way toward the slope. He quietly suggested moving the chairs back a bit, but for some reason, he didn't explain why. His family later remembered how he just kept quietly checking the ground, keeping his worries to himself so he wouldn't ruin the party. By early afternoon, the kids were running back and forth between the picnic blanket and the trail. One of his grandsons started walking toward a cooler that had mysteriously slid a little too close to the edge. Elias instinctively stepped after him. At that exact moment, a deep cracking sound tore through the soaked tree roots below the overlook, followed by a low shifting rumble from the hillside beneath the brush. The first section dropped only a few inches, but it was enough. Chairs tilted and the cooler slid toward the edge. Elias shoved his grandson back toward the trail just as the ground beneath him collapsed. He disappeared downhill with the moving soil before anyone could reach him. The slide wasn't massive, but it was fast and dense. Wet clay, rock, and broken branches carried Elias roughly 20 feet downhill before debris pinned him against a fallen tree. One arm remained partly visible above the mud, while the rest of his body was trapped beneath packed soil and rock. His family scrambled down the slick slope, trying to dig him out with their hands in a folding chair, but the saturated soil kept collapsing back into the hole. Elias moved briefly before stopping completely as the weight around his chest prevented him from breathing. Emergency services were called immediately, but the slope remained unstable when rescue crews arrived. Firefighters used shovels and stabilization boards to remove the debris piece by piece before finally recovering Elias's body. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner later ruled the death as compressional asphyxia after the slide buried Elias beneath heavy mud and rocks, crushing his chest and preventing him from breathing. He also suffered broken ribs, a fractured shoulder, and heavy bruising from striking a fallen tree during the collapse. And here's the heartbreaking twist. County officials later reviewed old terrain records for the overlook and discovered a 1998 assessment written by Elias himself, identifying the slope as a moderate landslide risk during prolonged rainfall. After the funeral, his family placed a small plaque near the trail entrance where he had spent decades warning others about unstable ground. What haunts me about Elias is that he knew the danger better than anyone and still stepped toward it to save his grandson, which makes what comes next feel almost crueler because the next person had no one to save, just a barbell and a goal that refused to wait one more day. It was midnight on November 7, 2016 in freezing Columbus, Ohio. Inside a cramped apartment basement, a lone lifter trained in a makeshift gym beneath the residential units upstairs. By that point, 31-year-old Priya Anand had pretty much built her entire life around competitive powerlifting. During the day, she worked full-time as a medical billing specialist, but almost every single night after work was dedicated to training. Her friends always described her as incredibly disciplined, deeply private, and fiercely stubborn once she locked her sights onto a goal. For nearly 3 years, she had been chasing a regional squat record in Ohio's amateur lifting circuit. She tracked every single workout in meticulous spreadsheets, filmed her heavy sets, and had even sunk thousands of dollars into building a proper basement gym because commercial gyms just closed too early for her grueling schedule. Like any serious lifter training at home, Priya knew the risks of heavy squatting without a spotter. Her setup was legit: a heavy steel squat rack bolted directly into the concrete floor, Olympic barbells, iron plates, chalk buckets, and resistance bands hanging from the exposed basement pipes. But there was one critical thing missing. She stubbornly refused to install safety spotter arms on the rack because she was convinced they messed with her squat depth in her training videos. To make matters worse, months earlier, she had cut ties with her coach after repeated arguments over her recovery, mounting fatigue, and her dangerous habit of attempting solo max lifts late at night. The timing that week only amplified the risk. Her birthday fell just 4 days before a regional qualifier she had spent months sweating for. Text messages later reviewed by investigators showed that Priya felt she was right on the edge of breaking through a frustrating plateau after a few really good heavy training sessions. But she had also dropped hints about dealing with nagging hip fatigue and terrible sleep over the previous week. Still, none of that was going to stop her from planning one final, absolute max attempt on the night of her birthday. Outside, freezing rain moved through Columbus, while Priya's roommate stayed upstairs watching TV before going to bed around 10:45 p.m. He later told investigators the occasional sound of weights hitting the floor was normal during her late-night training sessions. But downstairs, Priya was loading more weight onto the barbell than she had ever successfully lifted before. Around 11:14 p.m., Priya unracked the bar and descended into the squat under control. But halfway back up, the weight stalled. She fought the load for several seconds before her knees buckled forward. The bar crashed unevenly across her upper back and shoulders, collapsing her forward inside the rack. Priya tried dumping the weight backward, but one side of the bar struck the concrete floor first, rebounding and trapping her folded tightly beneath the barbell. The pressure wasn't directly crushing her chest, as much as forcing her upper body downward so hard that her chest became pinned against her thighs, leaving her unable to properly expand her lungs or straighten herself enough to breathe. Investigators later noted that Priya remained conscious for several minutes, repeatedly trying to push herself upward and reposition the bar off her upper back and neck. But the awkward folded position kept restricting her breathing more and more as exhaustion set in. Nearly 40 minutes later, her roommate went downstairs after noticing the music was still blasting from the basement. He found Priya motionless beneath the barbell and immediately called 911. When paramedics arrived, they attempted resuscitation while removing the weight, but she was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later ruled the death as compressional and positional asphyxia caused by prolonged entrapment beneath a loaded barbell. The autopsy also documented fractured ribs and severe muscle compression across her upper torso. Afterward, several lifters from Priya's gym helped install safety arms and emergency release straps in smaller private gyms across Columbus. During the next regional qualifier, multiple competitors reportedly refused to perform heavy warm-up squats alone after hearing how long Priya had remained trapped before anyone found her. There's something uniquely painful about Priya's story because the footage kept recording the whole time, and I find it hard not to think about that empty basement, which makes the next story almost worse, because he had a room full of people around him and still managed to die just as alone. It was October 12, 2019 in Portland, Oregon. Cold autumn rain tapped against the windows as guests arrived for a quiet birthday dinner inside Dr. Renaud Calvert's home. Downstairs, inside his basement laboratory, one small mistake had already been made hours earlier. Earlier that evening, 44-year-old Dr. Renaud Calvert prepared for his birthday dinner with the same precision that had shaped most of his career. Renaud worked as a forensic toxicology consultant across Oregon and Washington, assisting law enforcement and medical examiners in poisoning and overdose investigations. Colleagues described him as intelligent, methodical, and highly experienced around toxic substances. That confidence extended into his home laboratory. His converted basement workspace contained reagent shelves, microscopes, sample vials, and textbooks used for consulting work and university lectures. Earlier that afternoon, Renaud prepared a diluted ethylene glycol reference solution for a training presentation on toxic alcohol poisonings. Now, based on my research, ethylene glycol, commonly found in industrial antifreeze, becomes extremely dangerous after the liver converts it into corrosive acids that attack the kidneys and nervous system. While reorganizing supplies before guests arrived, Renaud temporarily poured the sample into a clean, unlabeled glass reagent bottle. As dinner prep moved upstairs, several bottles were shifted between the counter and a nearby wine cooler to make space for food trays and ice buckets. Investigators later found the unlabeled reagent bottle sitting beside chilled white wine meant for the party. Shortly before guests arrived around 7 p.m., Renaud walked into the kitchen carrying serving dishes and accidentally poured himself a glass from the wrong bottle without noticing immediately. Witnesses later said he reacted almost instantly after swallowing several mouthfuls. He paused, smelled the glass, and quietly rinsed his mouth at the sink. But instead of calling poison control or going to the emergency room, Renaud convinced himself the exposure was minor because he believed he had only swallowed a small amount of a diluted solution. Guests arriving for dinner later noticed him flipping through reference books and making handwritten calculations at the counter, trying to estimate exactly how much he had consumed and whether the dose was actually dangerous. Over the next several hours, his condition steadily worsened. Guests noticed him becoming flushed and unsteady, but he continued insisting he understood the symptoms. By midnight, friends urged him to go to the emergency room, but Renaud stayed home drinking water and calculating toxicity estimates on scattered sheets of paper across the kitchen counter. Around 3:40 a.m., Renaud collapsed walking toward the bathroom. His wife found him semi-conscious on the tile floor, vomiting and struggling to answer simple questions while breathing rapidly from severe acid buildup in his bloodstream. She called 911 immediately as another guest tried keeping him awake beside the doorway. Paramedics arrived roughly 8 minutes later and documented severe confusion and signs of acute metabolic distress. Hospital doctors quickly suspected toxic alcohol poisoning after blood tests showed catastrophic acid imbalance and rapidly worsening kidney failure. Despite emergency dialysis and antidote treatment, the delay allowed toxic metabolites to circulate through his body for too long. Renaud died roughly 36 hours after ingestion. The autopsy later found extensive crystal deposits throughout both kidneys, severe metabolic acidosis, and widespread organ failure. In simple terms, the chemical was converted into destructive acids and microscopic crystals that shut down his kidneys faster than treatment could reverse the damage. Investigators later recovered pages of handwritten toxicity calculations spread across the kitchen counter, showing that Renaud spent hours estimating his own survivability instead of seeking immediate treatment. Toxicology experts reviewing the case later concluded that early hospital intervention likely would have prevented the fatal organ damage entirely. Not long after, his wife dismantled the basement laboratory and donated most of his forensic textbooks to a university toxicology program in Portland. According to family friends, she kept only one thing from his lab: that empty glass reagent bottle investigators had photographed sitting by the kitchen sink that morning. What stays with me about Renaud is those handwritten pages beside the sink, a brilliant man doing math on his own survival instead of just picking up the phone. And the next story left me with that same exact frustration, because the thing that could have saved him was never more than 50 yards away. We're halfway through these stories, and if you don't want to miss what's coming next on this channel, consider subscribing. Now let's get back to it. It was July 3, 2017. Outside Fresno, California, extreme heat and thick smoke from nearby agricultural burns settled over the bee yards. The heavy air agitated the colonies, creating an unusually loud, defensive buzzing across the property long before workers approached the hives. Even with that uneasy atmosphere, 38-year-old Marcus Beaumont treated the morning like any other workday. Marcus had spent nearly 15 years managing commercial bee yards across Central California, supplying honey and pollination colonies to almond farms throughout the valley. His experience handling aggressive hives with minimal protective gear gave him a reputation for staying calm around swarming bees while younger workers panicked. But for me, that confidence slowly became part of the problem. Over the years, repeated stings had caused Marcus to develop a venom allergy so severe that doctors had prescribed him emergency epinephrine injectors. Commercial beekeeping is a gamble anyway, carrying constant sting exposure because workers routinely crack open densely packed hive boxes holding tens of thousands of bees. During summer harvests, heat, smoke, and any rough handling can turn a colony defensive in a heartbeat. Marcus knew this better than anyone, but he flat out hated carrying his injector because he thought it made him look weak around the other beekeepers. On the morning of his birthday, Marcus was out harvesting honey before sunrise, rushing to finish before the afternoon delivery truck arrived, and in time for the birthday dinner his wife had planned. If the honey sat out in the peak afternoon heat, the whole harvest could be ruined. Diego Morales, a seasonal farmhand, later noted that temperatures were climbing unusually fast. Worse, the wind kept blowing smoke from the canister straight back into the hives. Instead of calming the bees, the misplaced smoke agitated them. Marcus ignored the warning signs as he opened the final row of boxes. Workers noticed the bees slamming violently against their veils and clustering aggressively. Diego suggested waiting for the temperature to drop, but Marcus refused, determined to clear the shipment and get to his birthday plans. While removing one of the upper honey frames, Marcus jerked the box sideways just a bit too quickly, accidentally crushing part of the colony between the heavy wooden edges. Witnesses said the sound changed almost instantly. A dense, angry surge of bees erupted from the frame, swarming directly around his bare forearms and neck before he could even think to step away. Marcus stumbled backward, slapping at the bees as multiple stings landed across his wrist, his forearm, and the left side of his neck. Diego later told investigators that Marcus initially laughed it off, trying to brush it aside while continuing toward the equipment trailer with his metal hive tool still in hand. But within barely 2 minutes, his breathing became noticeably strained. His coughing got worse, and the swelling around his lips and eyes was visible from several yards away. Instead of heading straight for the farmhouse where his EpiPens were sitting in a kitchen drawer, Marcus walked toward the equipment barn to return his tools and shut down the smoker tank before stopping work. Surveillance footage mounted near the barn later showed him staggering slightly, gripping the side of a trailer just to keep his balance. By the time he reached the workbench inside the barn, he was gasping desperately for air and clawing at his throat. Diego called 911 seconds after finding Marcus collapsed beside the workbench, struggling unsuccessfully to breathe. Dispatch records later showed Marcus stopped responding before the call even ended. Workers searched the farmhouse for the injector, while another employee tried keeping him upright as swelling spread across his face and throat. Paramedics arrived roughly 13 minutes later and administered epinephrine and oxygen near the barn entrance. But Marcus had already gone into cardiac arrest before transport. He was pronounced dead at the scene. The coroner later ruled the death-fatal anaphylaxis caused by bee venom exposure. In simple terms, Marcus's immune system overreacted to the stings, causing his airway to swell shut and his blood pressure to collapse. The post-mortem examination documented severe swelling throughout the throat and upper airway, consistent with rapid allergic shock. Investigators later noted the nearest EpiPen remained inside the farmhouse, less than 50 yards away. After the incident, Marcus's younger brother installed emergency injector kits inside every truck, trailer, and honey station on the property, while several workers stopped handling hives alone during summer harvests. Marcus is the one I keep coming back to, maybe because the cruelty of it is so quiet. A drawer, 50 yards, never opened, but the next story is harder to sit with in a different way because there was no forgotten injector, just a choice made in front of everyone watching. On June 29, 2018, around midnight, A crowded apartment parking lot in South Tulsa, Oklahoma, was thick with smoke from hours of non-stop fireworks. Heat and black powder residue hung heavily in the stagnant night air as people gathered around the launch racks. Like so many weekends before this one, 26-year-old Jordan Pike spent the evening drinking with some buddies behind his apartment complex. During the week, he worked grueling overnight shifts operating forklifts at a big warehouse outside the city, so he usually used his weekends to blow off steam. He loved filming wild stunt videos around parking lots, drainage canals, and abandoned properties with his close circle of friends. To be fair, none of the videos ever really went viral, but Jordan just loved being the guy brave enough or reckless enough to try the dangerous stuff first. Consumer mortar fireworks use a lift charge beneath the shell to launch it high into the air before a separate aerial burst detonates overhead. But if a shell becomes lodged inside the launch tube, both the lift charge and the shell itself can rupture inside the tube instead of launching properly. That's why warning labels tell people to stay away from dud mortars for several minutes. That night, Jordan's group had already gone through multiple cases of fireworks bought from a roadside stand outside Tulsa. Neighbors later told investigators the drinking intensified as the night went on. Around 12:40 a.m., one large mortar shell failed to launch after the fuse burned down into the tube. The group waited briefly for a delayed shot, but nothing happened. Eventually, one of his friends suggested just leaving the dud alone and moving the launcher farther away from the parked cars. Jordan completely ignored him. Security footage from a nearby gas station later captured Jordan walking straight toward the mortar rack, holding a beer bottle in one hand and his phone in the other, while everyone else was actively backing away from the setup. Witnesses said Jordan seemed way more amused than worried. He kept staring straight down into the tube, using his phone's flashlight to see if the shell had just gotten stuck on the way up. The launcher sat upright beside a storm drain near the edge of the parking lot. Jordan leaned directly over the tube, lowering his face closer while steadying himself with one hand on his knee. Footage later showed several people turning away seconds before the shell ignited. Instead of launching normally, the shell ruptured inside the tube. The confined explosion sent the still-burning shell casing, lift charge, and tube fragments directly upward into Jordan's face and throat at point-blank range. Witnesses later described hearing a sharp concussive crack instead of the normal thud of a launch. The blast shattered large sections of his jaw and lower face, tore open the front of his neck, and embedded burning debris, cardboard casing, and plastic fragments deep into his upper chest and airway. Jordan staggered backward before collapsing onto the pavement beside the launcher. One friend rushed toward him, but backed away after seeing the extent of the injuries and heavy bleeding around his mouth and throat. Security footage showed people scattering behind parked cars, while another bystander tried putting out a small fire near the launch rack. A second-floor resident called 911 roughly 30 seconds after the blast. Fire crews and paramedics arrived about 7 minutes later and immediately requested advanced trauma support after finding catastrophic facial and airway injuries. Jordan lost consciousness before the ambulance left the parking lot and was pronounced dead during transport to the hospital. The medical examiner later concluded the mortar shell ruptured inside the launch tube, effectively turning the launcher into a close-range explosive device. The autopsy documented severe facial fractures, major neck trauma, airway burns, and penetrating blast injuries from debris driven into his throat and chest. Toxicology tests also confirmed heavy alcohol intoxication. Investigators later found older videos on Jordan's social media showing him relighting malfunctioning fireworks at previous parties. After the incident, the apartment complex permanently banned fireworks, and several witnesses later said the silence immediately after the blast stayed with them longer than the explosion itself.